That's really interesting. So far we've talked about two of the dominant discourses that you mentioned in your book. The third dominant discourse is the one of reflective practice. And in our first week, we talked about reflection as a form of learning. But in your book, you mentioned that reflective practice is a particularly popular discourse in higher education, particularly on initial teacher education programs. Can you explain to us why it's so popular in that particular area?
Well, I think the idea of reflecting on our practice, of thinking about what we're doing and trying to be, better or more effective, whatever we want to call it, it's not a new one. I think it's what teachers do. But I think it's kind of became sort of ratified, or it was given weight certainly by a lot of research and writing, particularly in the 80s and into the 90s. So I think it became sort of more formalised in a sense, and there was suddenly a weight of literature supporting the idea, and also encouraging people, teachers and teacher educators, to think more about, well, we talk about reflecting on our practice, but what do we mean by it? Let's explore the different kinds of reflection we might undertake or encourage our students to undertake. Let's think of what it might be for. What are the parameters within which we want to reflect? How do we get better at doing it? So I think it's always been something that teachers and teacher educators have believed in, but it became popularised, if you like, through research and academic writing. The writing of people like Schoen, for example, is often cited, but there are many others. So really, I think that's how it started. I think the idea became sort of consolidated during the 90s, almost in resistance to the introduction of the competencies discourse, as we called it, which was basically central government deciding what teacher education should be, what it should focus on, what it was really about, what teaching was about, what learning was about, and identifying a kind of competence-based model. That competence-based model didn't really include in any detail the idea of reflection on practice. I seem to remember the last competence, or towards the end, there was a statement, something like, teachers should also reflect on their practice, which wasn't really, it was really a kind of lukewarm acknowledgement rather than something of central importance. And I think that probably that kind of lukewarm response itself, produced a sort of equal and opposite reaction, if you like. So people were asking, people like myself were saying, well, why is reflection on practice, being so kind of overlooked or marginalised in this way? And so in itself, that perhaps encouraged us to make a stronger case and to develop the work in order to try and get it included in more in policy development and government thinking.
And so how does reflecting on practice help somebody become a better teacher?
Well, I'm tempted to say, how can we ever become better at what we're doing if we don't reflect on our practice? It goes back to this idea of becoming, I think. If we don't reflect on what we're doing, then I think we're likely to get stuck, and we're going to get stuck into this notion of being. So we have to be careful about what we mean by reflection, I think, as well. I mean, one of the problems with reflection being half-heartedly included in competencies was that then student teachers, for example, had to provide evidence that they were, because everything you have to provide evidence for. Well, you can provide evidence of lesson planning you can just produce your lesson plans in a folder. How do you produce evidence that you're reflecting on something? Well, of course, the easiest, most economic way of doing this is to have something written down. So evidence of reflection on practice then, I think, became a matter of, at the end of the day, sitting down and writing kind of evaluations of your lessons. That was evidence of reflective practice. but of course it's not really. That's not really what we mean. It becomes, I've described it as ritualistic. It doesn't necessarily, it becomes a job that you have to do. Here's the evidence, okay, I've completed that competence. So it really distracts us, I think, from what reflection is really about. And reflection is really about challenging, I think it's really about challenging the assumptions that you bring with you into teaching. It's trying to question how you do things in order that you might do them differently and we hope better. Or of course it might reinforce your belief in what you're doing. But it has to be proper reflection, I think. It has to be authentic reflection, which I think is very hard to, it's very hard to provide some sort of concrete evidence to somebody else that you're doing it. And I think that's a real problem, actually. Because if you live in a world in which you're constantly having to prove that you've done something, the things which it's hard to prove that you've done, that they become marginalised in your own practice and in your own thinking. So I think it's become quite hard, actually, to persuade a lot of teachers that reflection on practice is important and that it's something they need to keep on doing.
Teachers often talk about time as well, about
yeah,
the time
yeah,
for reflection,
yeah.
and evaluation, as you describe it, the bottom of a lesson
Yeah,
plan,
yeah.
is quite a quick and easy thing to do.
Yes, yeah.
Whereas the kind of reflection that you're talking about takes a lot more time.
It does, although, to be honest, anyone who's ever interviewed, teachers or beginning teachers about this knows that teachers have a habit, really, which some of their partners probably don't approve of not being able to switch off. So that it's not that they, at the end of the day, they go away and stop thinking about their teaching. They do think about it all the time. So in a sense, that the timing, of course it takes time to think about it, but I think that happens anyway. And I think what we need to do is try and encourage people to use the time more productively. There's a difference, I think, between going away. Well, there's a difference, for example, in going away feeling really wretched, beating yourself up and sort of running through all sorts of plans about how you're going to try and make things better the next morning. And there's a difference between that and going away and thinking, perhaps a little bit more calmly, and I hesitate to say it, but perhaps more objectively in a sense about what's happened and what you might do, and focusing on thinking about the teaching and learning, thinking about how you might do things differently in the future. So, the idea of reflective practice, to go back to the initial question, one of the ways in which it helps, I think, is to provide a more positive alternative and a more potentially productive alternative to what often happens, which is just going away and feeling really awful, about something that's happened, or even going away and feeling euphoric about something that went well, and then not really, thinking about it, or thinking about how it went well, how it went badly, what you might do differently in the future, and so on.
So how would the type of reflection that you're talking about, how would that be different from just thinking about what's happened during the day?
Well, because it's, I think, in two ways. First of all, it focuses more on questioning your own teaching, I suppose, and it also focuses. It's also more sort of future-oriented as well. It doesn't just look back at what happened, or you don't just think about what happened in the day. You think about it in a way which is going to feed into what you do in the future. In fact, when we talk about reflective practice, for a lot of people, there is no difference between thinking about their teaching and reflecting on their teaching. It's because some people think in a particular way about their teaching anyway. They think reflectively anyway about their teaching. They go away at the end of the day, perhaps. They think about what happened, not just that day, but any day, and they try and look forward to how they might do things in the future, things that worked, how they might develop those, things that didn't work, why didn't they work, how might I do things differently next time, do I need to prepare something differently, do I need to respond to somebody in a different way, I think, you know, and it's not just about sort of lesson planning and so on, it's also about, you know, the interactions we have with students, the sort of emotional aspects of things, you know. That is often, I think, what upsets teachers most. You know, if they have a confrontation with a student, or if a class just seems to go completely out of hand, it's very easy to just feel bad and not quite to know what to do. Reflection is more about regrouping, I think, and thinking, well, you know, this is not satisfactory. What am I going to do? And again, I'm not just going to focus on me. I'm going to focus on some of the things that I might do in order to make things better or different. So it's very much the idea that we focus on what we do, what we do that's different, rather than, you know, thinking too much about, you know, me. You know, do I need to change? Do I need to? So again, you kind of find a space to focus on the important thing, which is, you know, the student's learning.